Hello again, and welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk general aviation with relevant news and flying tips for pilots and student pilots to help keep you safe. I'm Max Truscott. I'm a full-time flight instructor, the author of several books on the Garmin G1000, 3000, 5000, and Perspective Glass cockpits, and the 2008 National Flight Instructor of the Year. Today, pilot examiner Jim Pitman talks about regulations and best practices for logging your flight time and making other entries in your logbook. Last week in episode 237, we talked about making a pop-up request for IFR and for a practice instrument approach, where you can find center and approach frequencies, what you should say on CTAF when going into a non-tired airport, and when you can legally log an instrument approach for currency purposes. So if you didn't hear that episode, you may want to check it out at aviationnewstalk.com/237. And this is a listener-supported show, and we are completely ad-free. So think about what it's worth to you if you were to learn just one thing that could save your life, and then sign up and become a member and support the show financially at aviationnewstalk.com/awesome. And when you do, I'll read your name on the show, and you can get various other goodies as well. This week in the news, a deadly airshow crash of a jet truck on the runway claims the life of the performer. Sonex has a new experimental jet you can build, and the pilot of a plane that crashed in Oregon carrying drugs is sentenced. All this and more, and the news starts now. From WWMT.com, that's a TV station in Michigan, a blown tire is likely the cause of a deadly crash involving a jet-powered racing truck at the Field of Flight Air Show and Balloon Festival over the weekend. Stuntman Chris Darnell, 40 of Springfield, Missouri, was killed instantly on the runway of the Battle Creek Executive Airport at Kellogg Field, Michigan, according to Battle Creek Police Department. The chain reaction likely started when a rear tire blew out seconds after the jet power truck launched down the runway, said Battle Creek Police Chief Jim Blocker. In a span of 11 seconds, the truck caught fire and rolled off the runway. The explosion was likely caused by a severed fuel line, according to Blocker. Blocker said, quote, "He did deploy his parachute early, so we can surmise from that he knew something was wrong." The Shockwave stunt truck is equipped with 3 jet engines and can reach top speeds of around 340 miles per hour. At the time of the crash, the truck was racing 2 airplanes in front of thousands of spectators. You see a piece of debris, which we concluded was a tire just prior to the pyrotechnic explosion, Blocker said. Investigators relied heavily on the expertise of the Missouri-based Darnell Racing Enterprise team, which operates 4 Shockwave jet-powered trucks, Blocker said. Neil Darnell, Christopher's father and founder of Darnell Racing Enterprises, said Saturday's crash was the first accident in more than 3 decades of operation. The father-son duo appeared at approximately 36 U.S. air shows each year. The crash left nearly a half-mile-long debris field. John Cudahy, president of the International Council of Air Shows, a nonprofit trade association comprised of professionals working in the air show community, said Chris's professionalism in the air show industry was unmatched, and he was passionate about every aspect of his business. From news.yahoo.com, Baltimore cops used a police helicopter to order swimmers out of a city pool. Baltimore police officers used a helicopter to demand people exit a public pool after it had closed. A city council member called the practice totally excessive. The City Parks District said there's been an uptick in misconduct at pools. The Baltimore Police Department used a police helicopter and a booming speaker to order swimmers to exit a closed public pool in an incident one city council member called totally excessive. "This is the Baltimore Police Department helicopter unit," an officer can be heard saying from a helicopter in a video shared on Twitter by WBFF photojournalist. "For your safety, exit the swimming pool. There is no lifeguard on duty." City Council member Zeke Cohen said on Twitter he's repeatedly asked the police department to stop using the helicopter to chase away kids at the pool. Cohen wrote in a tweet, "While I do worry about the safety of children swimming at night without a lifeguard, this ain't it. Totally excessive." In a statement, the Baltimore Police Department said checking the pools with a helicopter is a routine practice to prevent unattended drowning. The department said that when the video was taken, the officer spotted 20 people in one of the pools after it had closed and staff had left for the day. Officers informed the individuals that there were no lifeguards on duty and for their safety ordered the individuals to exit the pool, the department said. From FlyingMag.com, Sonex takes order for the lowest cost jet trainer ever. Kit-built aircraft maker Sonex said it's accepting deposits for its new Subsonics JSX-2T, a 2-place amateur-built personal jet. The new airplane is derived from the single-seat Subsonics JSX-2 that's been flying since 2014, and it is meant in part to serve as a trainer for that model and other jets. Indeed, the company said it designed the JSX-2T to be the lowest cost jet trainer ever. And I just want to mention here that one of the big issues with the Subsonics JSX-2 is that it's a single seat, and there is no way to train in that aircraft in advance. And so I believe Sonic has been using a glider in the past, which is similar in some ways, and have been using that for a trainer. So this will help take care of the training issue that's been around. Continuing, Sonic says it's building the JSX-2T prototype and will display it at AirVenture in Oshkosh. The company says it plans to begin flight testing this fall and to begin producing the kits during the second quarter of 2023. Deliveries of kits to customers are slated to begin during the fall or winter of 2023. The JSX-2T has side-by-side seating, a 21.8-foot wingspan, and uses the same PBS TJ-100 turbojet as the single-seat version. Sonic says it expects the airplane to have wing loading and handling characteristics similar to the single-seater. The deposit amount to reserve a kit is $15,000, and Sonic says the estimated cost of building the kit, which includes the engine, avionics, and interior upholstery, is under $155,000, compared with about $130,000 for the single-seater. The company says it will charge a $1,500 fee to customers who cancel their reservations. The Sonix is a V-tail with a single-jet engine mounted atop its rear fuselage, a design that draws comparisons with the Cirrus SF50 Vision Jet, even though the two are quite different, one being an experimental kit aircraft and the other a type-certificated aircraft. From RutherfordSource.com, MTSU Aerospace Study investigates pilot examiner shortage. A nationwide survey by the Middle Tennessee State University Aerospace Department is shedding light on a growing aviation industry problem and generating interest across the country. With the number of pilots needed growing as the industry returns to pre-COVID levels of activity, the ability to get pilots through the training pipeline is critical, said Professor Wendy Beckman. Beckman led the MTSU effort that began earlier this year. In 2021, there were more than 94,000 pilot check rides conducted nationally by examiners for various levels of certification. Given the surge in pilot training in the past several years, those check rides are taking longer to schedule and be completed by examiners. Beckman said, "This has been an issue for quite some time. It's a nationwide problem, and in 2018, Congress became involved and required that the FAA look at the designee system to determine what underlying issues there are." In response to that congressional mandate, a working group was created to provide recommendations for reforms. Beckman was concerned that the FAA had not reached out to the flight training community and to designated pilot examiners to obtain their observations about the problems being experienced and potential solutions. Researchers in the Aerospace Department developed a survey based on the recommendations from the working group. The results? Perspectives differed considerably between examiners and flight school respondents regarding the current availability of check rides, with flight schools perceiving a much greater issue, she said. Specifically, flight schools responded that only 40% of their applicants are able to schedule a check ride within a 2-week period, while DPEs indicated they believe that 80% of applicants are able to schedule a check ride within 2 weeks. Additionally, significantly more flight schools, 83%, perceived there were too few DPEs available in their geographical area versus DPEs, 21%. The FAA has indicated it anticipates releasing its response to the working group recommendation this month. From avweb.com, Flight Instructor Hall of Fame names 2022 inductees. The Flight Instructor Hall of Fame has named Catherine Cavagnaro and Ron Timmermans to its 2022 class of inductees. The Flight Instructor Hall of Fame is administered by NAFI, the National Association of Flight Instructors, and inductees represent individuals who have made significant contributions to aviation education and flight instruction while reflecting credit upon themselves and their profession. The induction ceremony for the 2022 class will take place at the American Bonanza Society's 14th annual membership dinner, which will be held during EAA AirVenture in Wisconsin at the end of July. John Niehaus, NAFI Director of Program Development and Administrator of the Hall of Fame Award Program, said, "Every year the individuals we choose from are the best our industry has to offer, and this year is no different. Catherine and Ron have given so much of themselves, and this is our chance as an industry to give back to them. My sincere thanks go out to our volunteer judges who each year work to make the selection of the induction class, and to the ABS for allowing the induction at their annual membership dinner." And I'd like to offer our congratulations to both Catherine and Ron, and of course you've probably heard Catherine Cavagnaro many times here on this show. From thecoastnews.com, new details emerge in GoJump's fatal plane crash in Oceanside, California. The NTSB recently issued a preliminary report concerning the fatal crash of a small airplane operated by a skydiving company near the Oceanside Municipal Airport suggesting the pilots were dealing with an unresponsive throttle, which resulted in the plane being unable to land safely on the runway. The Cessna 208B Caravan, operated by Go Jump America, crashed around 2 p.m. on June 3rd near Bob Maxwell Field while attempting to descend back to the airport runway. The plane was on its sixth skydiving flight of the day and had already dropped off the skydivers before the crash, leaving just 2 pilots on board. The crash killed 1 woman on board, confirmed to be a pilot in training, and severely injured 1 man, another pilot who was training the first. The San Diego County Medical Examiner has identified the pilot killed in the crash as 24-year-old Mission Viejo resident Paige Hulbert. Hulbert completed ATP flight school in 2020 and had earned her CFI, CFII, and multi-engine instructor certificates, according to LinkedIn. The injured pilot was identified on social media as Matt Wampler, chief pilot at Skydive Spaceland San Marcos in San Marcos, Texas. A GoFundMe set up to help Wampler with medical costs has raised over $21,000. Both the FAA and the NTSB are investigating. A preliminary report release states that the right-seated pilot, referring to Wampler, could not recall many of the details leading up to the accident, presumably because of his severe injuries, but that he recalled everything going as planned with the departure and unloading of the skydivers during the flight. During this flight, Wampler was conducting training for Halbert, who had 6 days of experience flying a Cessna 208 and was on her 3rd day in the left seat. Wampler recounted to investigators that as the plane was making its final ascent in an idle power position, he attempted to increase the engine power via the throttle twice, but found it unresponsive. With the aircraft an estimated 400 feet above the ground, Wampler told investigators he aimed for an open dirt field. However, upon noticing a berm in the immediate flight path, he maneuvered the plane into a right turn. The NTSB report states that the plane struck the ground in a nose-down position before hitting the berm and coming to a stop. The June 3rd accident marks the second crash of a Cessna 208B operated by Go Jump near the Oceanside Municipal Airport in the past 4 months. Another crash in late February left 2 pilots severely injured but did not result in casualties. The company's operation appears to have continued at normal since the June 3rd crash, with customers able to book jumps throughout the upcoming weeks. Go Jump officials have not responded to multiple requests for comment. From GeneralAviationNews.com, pilot forgets to install engine oil cap before takeoff. The pilot reported that before conducting an aerial application flight near Hardington, Nebraska, he changed the oil in the Cessna A188. After refueling and loading the airplane with chemicals, he departed. Shortly after takeoff, the windshield became covered with oil, which limited the pilot's visibility. He turned the airplane left toward a grass runway. He did not dump the chemical load, and the airplane had a low airspeed and began to lose altitude. The pilot was not able to attain a climb, so he chose to conduct a forced landing in a cornfield near the end of the runway, during which the wing sustained substantial damage. The pilot reported the reason oil covered the windshield was that he had not reinstalled the oil cap after changing the oil. He added that he had gotten out of his routine while performing the oil change, and that complacency and being in a hurry were also some factors in the accident. Probable cause: the pilot's failure to ensure that the engine oil cap was installed before takeoff, which resulted in the oil obscuring the pilot's view through the windshield and necessitated a forced landing on unsuitable terrain. Contributing to the accident were the pilot's complacency and self-induced pressure to complete the flight. And I'm aware of 2 flights that have occurred in one of our SR20s at the club where I teach, and one of the older ones, where the fuel cap was left off because the fueler had offered to add a quart of oil and then forgot to put the fuel cap back on. And I will say that the particular fuel caps are on chains. The chain is so short that it does not come out on top of the cowling, so it's completely out of sight and out of view. So just keep that in mind if you're adding oil to an older SR20. And from Ocala.com, pilot suffered stroke while trying to land plane. A pilot who died while attempting to land an aircraft on a private airstrip in 2020 suffered a medical episode that caused her to lose control of the plane, according to a report issued by the NTSB. NTSB investigator Ralph Hicks said in the preliminary report that the pilot's stroke likely contributed to this accident. He believes an acute stroke caused an unstabilized approach and subsequent loss of airplane control during landing. The pilot, age 78, was pronounced dead by first responders on July 1, 2020 at Leeward Air Ranch, a private aircraft community located off Baseline Road in southeast Marion County. The pilot was on a cross-country flight and was landing an Vector Aerotechnic Sportstar light sport aircraft when witnesses said the final approach was shaky. Quote, "She did not attempt to go around and the airplane bounced after landing long down the runway. The pilot subsequently lost aircraft control and the airplane came to rest finally inverted in a grassy area about 2,500 feet down and 200 feet east of the runway, according to the report. The wreckage was examined and did not reveal evidence of a pre-accident malfunction or anomaly. The pilot was the only person on board, according to the NTSB. And from avweb.com, GA Accident Bulletin for June 27, 2022, I've picked out two of their stories. One is about an accident from March 25th at Winder, Georgia. A Cessna 172P Skyhawk was destroyed at about 10:48 a.m. Eastern Time after an apparent flight control system failure. The CFI and student pilot were seriously injured. Visual conditions prevailed. While on final approach after several circuits in the traffic pattern at a nearby airport, the student pilot turned the yoke to the right and felt it give as if a cable had become detached. The flight instructor took control of the airplane and experienced the same effect. The yoke could be turned in a complete circle with no response from the airplane. The airplane veered to the right and descended into trees. A post-impact fire consumed the fuselage and wings. And from March 27, 2022 in Sparta, Tennessee, this is a Cessna 172F Skyhawk accident. At about 11:30 a.m. Central Time, the airplane was substantially damaged when its landing gear failed at liftoff. The student pilot and CFI were not injured. Visual conditions prevailed. During a go-around maneuver, they heard a pop sound as the airplane lifted off. Shortly after takeoff, the student pilot informed the instructor that the left main landing gear had separated from the airplane. They flew for about 2 hours to burn fuel before they landed with a fractured gear leg. The landing was uneventful, and the airplane came to a stop on the runway. The examination revealed the left main landing gear struck the horizontal stabilizer when it separated, resulting in substantial damage. And finally from MailTribune.com, Medford, Oregon pot plane pilot gets time served. An Idaho man whose summer 2019 plane crash in Medford, Oregon sparked simultaneous drug investigations in 2 states will serve no additional time behind bars for his role trafficking thousands of dollars worth of illicit marijuana extract across state lines. Matthew William Thompson, 41, was sentenced in U.S. District Court in Medford to time served, a year of home confinement, 3 years of supervised release, and 100 hours of community service. He was arrested for possessing with intent to distribute hash oil when he crashed a 1947 Beach 35 Bonanza with a lapsed registration into a tree June 8, 2019 in the 2300 block of Whittle Avenue in Medford. At about 1:56 p.m. that afternoon, the plane had engine trouble after refueling at the Medford airport, according to documents filed in Thompson's case and earlier news reports. Thompson and his passenger, Zachary Wayne Moore, walked away from the crash with only minor injuries. However, almost immediately after crash landing, the pair ran back to the wreckage, which was leaking fuel for their cargo. Medford police and federal agents later found several jars containing more than 3.5 pounds of marijuana extract known as butane honey oil purchased in Cave Junction for $1,500 a pound. In the days that followed the crash, Boise, Idaho police issued a search warrant on Thompson's home, shared with Moore at the time, where police found a marijuana extraction lab. Thompson ultimately will have served 42 days in jail, according to Ada County, Idaho court records. Thompson pleaded guilty June 13th in Ada County District Court to a state charge of possessing hash oil with intent to manufacture or deliver. Thompson pleaded guilty in February on the Medford-based felony charge and in early June was sentenced in Idaho to 4 years of probation and 100 hours of community service. Thompson will have to pay $1,500 in restitution to victims whose vehicles were damaged in the Medford plane crash. The terms prohibit Thompson from directly contacting the 2 victims in the case. Well, that's the news for this week. Coming up next, a few updates, and then we'll talk with DPE Jim Pitman about regulations and best practices regarding logging flight time and other entries in your logbook. All right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And let's start off with the good news department. Lots of good news. 4 different people with new certificates or ratings. This first comes from Michael Baraz out in Chicago, who passed his CFII. He says, thanks for sharing that video on Circle to Land, which was something I posted for Patreons a week or so ago. He says, I put together a pretty good Circle to Land lesson plan. A buddy and I have been doing safety pilot for a while, evaluating, critiquing, and acting as ATC, so the whole thing wasn't a big leap. I tested with Alan Zielinski, who has a reputation for a challenging oral, asking questions until above the applicant's knowledge level. I killed it. His practical was very practical. He was a student and I was the instructor. Very reasonable. I was pleased with my performance. Almost went to Michigan to do it with Jason Blair, but my plane is in the shop, and that is just too far away for a 172 trip. Anyway, I'm relieved and excited to have passed. So congratulations, Michael. And Patreon supporter Chris Hewitt passed his instrument. He said, just wanted to drop you a line. After the birth of my son in 2018, I took a break from flying and put a pause on my instrument rating at that time. In February of this year, I got back into the cockpit with a local CFII, and on June 30th, I passed my check ride and received my instrument ticket. I found myself listening to your episodes with Jason Blair and Seth Luke over and over again in the days and weeks running up to my ride. Thanks again for your podcast. I appreciate it. And it's a hit with EAA Chapter 406, as we routinely reference it at our monthly IMC Club meetings at the Bremerton Airport. That's KPWT. And in a follow-up, he says, oops, I meant Seth Lake, not Seth Luke. I just watched Star Wars. It must have been subliminal. Congratulations to you, Chris. And patron supporter Richard Green says, hi, Max. I'm a listener for the podcast and a new contributor. After getting my private in 1989, I'm getting back into flying. I recently passed my instrument rating. I found the episodes with the DPE most encouraging and enlightening. I fly a Cessna 182 and 206 with CAP and a 172 with Orange County Flyers out of John Wayne Airport in SoCal. I'm looking forward to many more interesting and informative episodes. And congratulations to patron supporter Jack Tilbury, who passed his private. He says, hi, Max, just to let you know that I passed my private a few weeks ago here in the UK. Thank you for all of your help. I feel that your podcasts have given me a much deeper understanding of all aspects of flying than I could possibly have gained just through my flight school. Thank you for all your hard work in helping make us safer pilots. Congratulations to all of you. And here's an article from AOPA. I'll include a link to this in the show notes. It's called It Will Never Happen to Me. I kind of thought back to my early years in flying. Actually, not that early, probably for at least 10 or more years. I used to think the same thing. It will never happen to me. All of those things I was reading about in the magazines, oh yeah, that always happens to other people. It'll never happen to me. And let me just mention a few of things that have happened that I thought would never happen to me. One of them is get there-itis or get home-itis. I talked about that in a prior episode in which I encountered icing while I had a crying 2-year-old in the right seat with me. And boy, never underestimate the influence or power of a crying 2-year-old. You'll do things that you never thought you would do, including plowing on through terrible weather. So I did get home-itis then. Thought I would never have a vacuum pump failure, and yet I rented an airplane one time years ago in Mansfield, Ohio, and I was going to fly to a meeting in Philadelphia at my college there. And lo and behold, I did not yet have my instrument rating. I was a couple of months away from it. I was overtopped the clouds about an hour into my flight, and boom, the vacuum pump failed. And I kind of thought, you know what? Now, if the engine fails, I'm going to be going down through the clouds without two of my most important gyro instruments, the attitude indicator and the DG. So I made a U-turn and took the airplane back to Mansfield, Ohio. And of course, I had a very long drive, about 6+ hours through rain and so on. So that was a very memorable flight. And of course, I thought I would never end up VFR into IMC, though that's happened to me at least 2 times I can remember off the top of my head. And that's in spite of doing everything I could do to avoid doing that. So check out the article, It Will Never Happen to Me. If you have thought that, I assure you, if you fly long enough, these things will happen to you. And here's a quick tip to anyone who has signed up to support the show via Patreon. If you have never received any follow-up messages from me of any kind, go into patreon.com and check your settings. You may have to check settings to allow email notifications, and I'd certainly hate for you to miss out on any of the posts that I send out or any of the individual messages that I send to you. So please check your settings in patreon.com. And here's a message from new Patreon supporter Rick Schultz. He says, as an aside, the eureka moment for me while listening to episode 236 that inspired my sponsorship was when you mentioned specifically the newer AIM 123C5 and Draft AC 90119 standards that allow GPS to be used in coordination when monitoring the VOR on a secondary radio for a VOR approach. Also, the specific prohibition of using this method of an ILS localizer approach. Well, Rick, thank you so much for signing up to support the show. And if you've ever had one of those driveway moments where you've just arrived home, but you stay in the car just to continue listening to Aviation News Talk because you've learned something compelling, I'll hope you consider signing up for the show. And speaking of Patreon, it's that time of the month, the beginning of the month, where, oh gosh, we lose a whole bunch of supporters because their credit cards expire. And we just had a record 11 supporters whose credit cards have expired. That's about double the most we've ever seen before. And typically, more than half of those people never go in and update their credit card, possibly because they're not receiving any messages from me. So we're always looking for new supporters to make up for those that we lose each month. And let me mention some fine folks who've just signed up. Perhaps you know some of these people. First, we have a new mega supporter, and that's Arjun Garage. And he writes that I'm excited to support the podcast through Patreon. I fly a 2021 G6 Cirrus SR20 out of KVGT. That would be the North Las Vegas Airport. Been there a number of times. And I learned something from your show even after flying for over 10 years. I personally like your thoughtful analysis of accidents and incidents. So Arjun, thanks so much for signing up. And we have several other new supporters. They include Stanley Perkins at the $35 a month level, so he gets access to my online training courses. Michael Ormont and Richard Green signed up at the $20 a month level, so they get access to all of the videos that I post, 3 or 4 of each month. And we also have David Ford, Rick Schultz, and CH, who are all signed up at the $8 a month level, and Chris Hewitt added up to $10 a month. And moving over to PayPal, we have 2 one-time donations. They include a gentleman who I'm still waiting to hear back from who made a very large one-time donation. I'll tell you more about that next time. And also from John Chargo. He donated $100. He said, I started working for Reliable Robotics a couple of weeks ago. I'm absolutely loving it. Your show clued me into their work. Thanks. And, of course, we did an interview with the CEO, Robert Rose of Reliable Robotics, back in episode 173. They're in the business of doing remotely piloted cargo aircraft. And if you'd like to be like these fine folks and sign up to become a member of the show, just head on out to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome to sign up via Patreon or aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal. Coming up next, we're talking with DPE Jim Pitman about regulations and best practices regarding logging flight time and other entries in your logbook. All right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And now let me tell you a little bit about Jim Pitman. He's based in Phoenix, Arizona. He's been a flight instructor since 1997, a pilot for SkyWest since 2016, and a DPE giving check rides since 2019. He was the 2005 Arizona Aviation Safety Counselor of the Year and the Arizona Flight Instructor of the Year in 2006 and 2020, as well as the Regional Flight Instructor of the Year in 2020. You can learn more about Jim and find links to his resources at flywithjim.com. And now here's our conversation with Jim Pitman. Jim, welcome to the show. Great to have you here.
Thanks, Max. Great to be here.
You proposed what I thought was really an excellent topic, which we haven't really talked about in detail, which is logging. Take a moment and just explain to people why logging in the logbook correctly is so important. Talk about it first in the context of a pilot who flies for fun, and then later someone who might want to become an airline pilot.
All right, very good. This is important for people who are just flying for fun. And you asked me to comment also on, those who are going for airline jobs. I mentioned interviews. It could be interviews for people that, want to get a job flying charter, flying the airlines. Usually a basic part of an interview is to go through logbooks and to see how things are logged. And I've noticed as I do check rides, there's a lot of confusion even among flight instructors. I've certainly noticed it when it comes to logging nighttime, a lot of confusion about that topic. Logging cross-country time is another one that's commonly misunderstood. And, I'm usually spending a certain amount of time helping people understand what the proper definitions are. And what really prompted this document that we're sharing today, I don't know, it was a few months ago, I happened to see a post on Facebook. It was in a private group for my airline. And someone asked a very sincere and honest question about logging simulator time. And in terms of our annual training that we do with our airline, and hey, how should I put this in my logbook? And I glanced at the comments, and keep in mind, this is a group of airline pilots, most of which are former flight instructors. And the misinformation that was being given in the comments to answer this simple question of how should I log sim time, it really got to me. It bothered me. And I think what bothered me most, Max, was the certainty that people were using when they were answering this question. And they were so wrong, and their answers were so different and covered a very wide spectrum of what to do and what not to do and whether to even log it at all. And so with everything I've seen from the check rides and with that particular post, I just want to put something out there that I can share with people with an easy link and say, here's some information, go check it out. And I sat down, I actually had a couple overnights on an airline trip, and I had my laptop and I just started typing. And when I came up for air, it was, 8 or 9 pages long. And so it was really just from my experience of what I've seen over my almost 30 years of flying. And that's the document that we're sharing today.
That's great. And I'm happy that you've done this. It's certainly an area, as I was reading through your document, there were things where I thought, I've kind of wondered about that. So I found it valuable, and I'm sure other people will as well. Now, let's talk about regulation versus opinion. Now, interestingly, I think there are relatively few regulations surrounding logbooks, but even where we do have regulations, sometimes people still get it wrong. So talk about regulation versus opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know you're going to share the link, but for anyone that wants to follow along, as long as you're not driving your car, I would encourage people, it's simply flywithjim.com/pilot logbooks. And that'll redirect to the PDF if you guys want to follow along. We're not going to go through the whole thing here, Max, but just a few of the sections. So you asked about regulation versus opinion, and there are a lot of opinions out there, just like everything in flying, right? There's policy, there's the way the FAA says to do it in the handbooks, and then there's a lot of technique. And it's the same way when it comes to logbooks. So just to be clear, I tried to do my best to link to official sources, and a lot of what I think is the value in this document is the fact that I link to specific sources from the FAA. And I also share a lot of opinions, and I try to point out when I'm doing that. So yes, a lot of this is my opinion. When I share my opinion, I do share reasons for why I think it's a good idea. And with anything we do in life, and certainly within aviation and flight training, I encourage everyone to just ask that question. Is this a regulation, or is this someone's opinion? Or is this guidance from an official source like the FAA, or is it just what someone thinks I should be doing? And we all need to be able to answer that question for ourselves.
Yeah, it's great to be able to track it back to the actual regulation where one exists. Well, let's talk about corrections. I think that's an area where people really have mixed ideas as to how to make corrections in logbooks. And this comes up all the time. And as a flight instructor, I sometimes write things down incorrectly. What is your recommendation for how to handle corrections in paper logbooks?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a great example of something that's just my opinion, because the FAA does not, necessarily give specific guidance on this. But I do have some experience from non-aviation sources when it comes to official, legal documents and making corrections. And let me first say, and I'm glad you brought this up, is when someone goes through and reads this document, they're probably going to realize that they have some corrections that need to be made in their logbook. And of course, if you're using an electronic logbook only, it's pretty easy to make corrections. Anyone that's using a paper logbook, what I recommend is, instead of changing something in the past that's going to affect your totals on several pages, the technique that I was taught years ago that works very well is to make a correction line. So simply figure out what needs to be fixed. And let's just say you're going to add some cross-country time to make a correction, and you're going to add some night time because you were logging that wrong, and you're going to subtract some PIC time because you were logging that wrong. Well, just go to your most recent page that's not yet complete. Pick, for example, the bottom line that's blank, and just put in a correction line with all of the appropriate pluses and minuses. And then in the comments, simply put the reason you're making the corrections. And then when you total that page, everything's on track. So there's no white out or green out, as the case may be. There's not even any crossouts. It's just a correction line that fixes the totals and documents why you're making the correction. And I've got plenty of corrections in my paper logbooks before I went totally electronic years ago. And I always just told myself it gives my logbook character. So there you go.
Well, and you are a character, so that helps.
There you go. It works. It works.
And we have many characters in aviation, which is part of the richness, I think, of having friends in aviation. Let's talk about logging solo time. I think that's something that is often misunderstood.
A lot of people don't realize that solo is an abbreviation that means sole occupant of aircraft. And that means you're the only human on board. And that's important. That's an important distinction. I think the way I say it in my document is you might have your dog with you, and your dog may be a legitimate family member, but they're not a human. And from the FAA's point of view, they don't count as another soul. So if it's just you and your dog, you're solo. But as soon as you put another human in that aircraft, even a baby in a car seat situation, it's not solo anymore. You now have a passenger.
So talk about that in the context of some of the requirements, say, for commercial check rides. There's some solo requirements there. Explain that.
And this goes along with another section that I talked about, which is logging PIC versus acting as PIC, being pilot in command. And yeah, if a requirement says that you need to be solo, then you've got to be the only human in the airplane. That's very clear. Being the PIC is a whole nother discussion. I'll quickly touch on that by saying AOPA has done some great documentation on this, and I link to their page from my document. And I share a couple of my own examples of or how to better understand acting as PIC versus logging PIC. There's definitely a lot of confusion on that one as well.
Well, give us a little more detail about that. And also, I understand you have a story related to this.
Yeah, so I remember my CFI initial check ride. It's actually a story that kind of illustrates the difference between acting as PIC and logging PIC. And when you read the regulations, it talks about the fact that, of course, to act as PIC, you need to be fully qualified with endorsements and everything because you are acting as the pilot in command. But there are certain situations where you can log PIC, for example, sole manipulator of the controls in an aircraft in which you are rated. And the FAA has defined through other letters of interpretation that to be rated means category and class, for example, airplane single engine land or type rating if needed, but does not include endorsements like a high performance endorsement or complex endorsement. So the example on my CFI check ride, I did my first high performance training in a Cessna 182 back in the day. And I forget how many hours, let's just say it was 8 hours of training where I was the sole manipulator of the controls and I was a private pilot with the airplane single engine land. And on my CFI check ride, I remember the examiner saying that I needed to remove the time that I logged in the 182 before I had the high performance endorsement. And of course, I wasn't going to argue with the examiner the day of my check ride. So he basically demanded that I fix my logbook in front of him. And later, of course, I did my own homework and I'm like, no, he was wrong. I was sole manipulator of the controls in an aircraft in which I was rated, even before I had the high performance endorsement. So that was totally legitimate to log pilot in command. So people who have a paper logbook with extra columns, what I recommend is to actually have a column for logging PIC and a separate column for acting as PIC. And for people who use an electronic logbook, it's even easier. In fact, a lot of the recommendations that I make in this document, in this PDF, are to use extra columns to help keep things straight.
So going back to your example and your story, perhaps the examiner was saying you were not the PIC and you logged it as PIC time. And so those two categories were basically confused because they were both in the same column.
And it's true, I was not acting as PIC. My instructor was acting as the PIC because I was in training and I didn't have a high performance endorsement, but I was logging PIC under a different section of the regulations. And in the logbook I had at the time, there was only one column for PIC. And that's where a lot of the confusion comes from.
Sure. Yeah. So you had logged PIC time and maybe the examiner was saying, but you weren't the PIC.
Yeah.
Yeah. Very confusing. I agree. Having two columns makes a lot of sense to sort that out. Let's talk about cross-country time. And if you would, relate it to some of the requirements, both for private and commercial people who are working on those ratings, or rather on those certificates.
There you go. I wasn't going to correct you, but thank you.
Thank you.
So, most of us learn that cross-country, and of course, we should probably preface that everything we're sharing as examples here is coming from the FAA, and you have a lot of international listeners. So In other countries, just as necessary. But here in the US, most of us learn early on that cross country is when we fly somewhere and land more than 50 nautical miles from the original point of departure. And I found that a lot of people go through their entire training process thinking that that's the one and only definition of cross country. And it's not. And it's not even the basic definition of cross country. So in this document, of course, I provide the links right to the proper definitions. And we're talking about 14 CFR 61.1 Bravo. Those are in alphabetical order, so just look for cross-country time if you're looking up 61.1. And the general or basic definition of cross-country basically just says someone who's rated as a pilot navigates themselves somewhere else and lands. And it doesn't give any distance requirement. That's the general basic definition of cross country. It's only when you get down a couple more paragraphs or so where it talks about the fact that if you're going for a private pilot certificate, it needs to be more than 50 nautical miles. If you're going for an instrument rating or commercial certificate, there's other specific requirements when you're in training for a particular certificate or rating. And then there's another definition that has to do with ATP, which says that you can fly more than 50 nautical miles and you don't even have to land, and that counts as cross country. So my recommendation for this one, and you're going to be able to tell here pretty quick, I highly recommend using an electronic logbook because it's a lot easier to keep track of this stuff. But basically have 3 different columns for cross country time. Have the first one for all cross country time. Have the second one for more than 50 nautical miles with a landing, and have the third one for ATP cross country for anyone who's planning to go on to any kind of professional career. And if you do that from the very beginning, it's easy to keep track of it all. But it's important to understand, especially someone who buys their own airplane, most aircraft owners, once a year, they have to fill out a report for their insurance company. And it usually just asks for, what's your total cross country time? Well, that should be the general definition of cross country because they're not going for a certificate or rating. They're just answering a question on a document. And I've never heard of this happening, but we know that when there's an insurance claim, it's very important that you have all your I's dotted and all your T's crossed. You don't ever want to give an insurance company any reason that they can get out of paying a claim. So this would be an example where being accurate is important.
Well, there are lots of reasons to try and be accurate, not the least of which might be, for example, if you got violated by the FAA for something and they started looking through your logbook, you don't want to find that you get additional violations because they now have the opportunity to search through your logbook.
Those are some great negative examples. More on the positive side, I've met pilots who have been shorting themselves on cross country for their ATP. They're thinking that it all had to be more than 50 nautical miles, and they've got all this other time when they flew more than 50 miles and didn't land. They could have counted that.
Yeah, that's a really great point. Well, let's talk a little bit about something else that's confusing at times, and that's logging nighttime and night operations. Talk about that.
So I often hear, and I probably even used to teach, that there's 3 definitions of night. And that kind of bothers me now because there's not. There's really only one definition of night. And so the way that I teach it and the way it is in this document is there's one definition of night, and then there's 2 other regulations that have to do with darkness. And this is understandably confusing because the FAA, we understand that different regulations came from different areas of the FAA at different times, and they don't always agree with each other. We get that. But the one and only definition of night from the FAA is the one that talks about the time between the end of evening civil twilight until morning civil twilight. Okay, so just remember, civil twilight is the key for the definition of night. When do we use that? Well, in your logbook, when you're logging nighttime. That's definition of night. When you're filling out an application, like an IACRA application for a check ride, and it asks for your total nighttime, that would come from that. Insurance forms, what's your nighttime? Anything that wants to know your night takeoffs and landings, the time that you spent flying at night, it should all be based on evening civil twilight. It used to be easier to look that up. The Naval Observatory, whatever, they're the official timekeepers. And last time I checked, their website is not working the way it used to, but there are places online where you can find it. Basically, it's around 25 minutes after sunset, okay, just for sake of discussion. And it changes a little bit depending on where on the planet you are. So the confusion related to the other two rules has to do with carrying passengers and when nav lights or position lights are required. So carrying passengers is a specific rule that talks about 1 hour after sunset to 1 hour before sunrise. That is not a new definition of night. It's just a specific requirement in 6157 talking about currency requirements, currency to be legal to carry passengers at that time. And then the nav lights is sunset to sunrise. It would be wonderful if all three of those use the same definition, but they don't. And when you get into the details, it kind of makes sense for different reasons. And, it's nice that we can operate up to 59 minutes after sunset carrying passengers, and we don't, we're still legal whether we've got our night currency or not. But it causes a lot of confusion for sure. I see a lot of people going for check rides that they're waiting until an hour after sunset to go do their night requirements. That's not required. Night is the end of Civil Twilight. So I think there's a lot of people wasting a good 30, 35 minutes of their day because they're waiting longer than they need to. Not a big deal, okay. But I think people are shorting themselves on night takeoffs and landings. They do a takeoff or landing 45 minutes after sunset and they think, oh, this doesn't count. Yes, it does. It counts as a night takeoff or landing. It may not count for your carrying passengers at a certain time of the evening, but it certainly is a night takeoff or landing as long as it's after the end of evening Civil Twilight. So again, it's a detail, but it's not that difficult to understand it if you just take a few minutes and read what it says.
In terms of Civil Twilight, I've actually heard people ask the tower or ground, hey, what's Civil Twilight tonight? And usually they'll get back to you in a minute and go, it's 6:28. So they're certainly able to determine it. I usually go out to airnav.com, and that's a quick place for me to get weather for my local airports, and it shows Civil Twilight as well, which is great.
Very good. I love that site as well. Yeah.
So let me ask you this. Do you know the actual definition behind Civil Twilight?
As far as the number of degrees the sun is below the horizon?
Oh, very good. That's it. Yeah.
Yeah. What is it, like 6 degrees?
That's it. Excellent.
You
were spot on.
A counter question for you, Max.
Oh, no.
Salt Lake City is a great example. You've got the big mountains, both to the east and to the west. Is the horizon where the sky meets the top of the mountain? Because, you could have 2 hours of twilight in Salt Lake City, depending on the time of year, right?
That is an excellent question. I have no idea. Do you know the answer?
You know what? I don't. I probably shouldn't ask the question without knowing the answer, but I'll have to go look it up on AirNav and see if they show a long twilight period there.
Yeah, and you raise a really good point because it could be really dark much sooner than is indicated by Civil Twilight if, for example, they don't account for the presence of the mountains. So we've got a lot of smart listeners. I'm sure somebody will get back to us.
There we go.
Let us know about that. Well, let's see. Moving right along here, we'll talk about the definition of flight time. I think that's an interesting area that I think a lot of people kind of debate. When can they start logging actual flight time?
I actually have had a change of tune on this one. So this is also from CFR. Actually, this is a different place. I always get mixed up between 61.1, which has some important definitions. And then there's also what would be usually referred to as FAR Part 1, or more technically correct, 14 CFR Part 1. So in Part 1.1 is where we find the definition of flight time. And it's pretty short. Let me go ahead and read it. The part that's going to apply to us anyways. Pilot time that commences when an aircraft moves under its own power for the purpose of flight and ends when the aircraft comes to rest after landing. And then there's a different definition for gliders. We'll just keep it on aircraft. So we're talking about airplanes or helicopters, basically. All right. So moves under its own power. Okay. Does that mean that the airplane has to move position? We all know that certainly for rental aircraft, we pay for Hobbs time, which is time the engine starts turning until we shut it down. And that's what everyone puts in the logbook. So the FAA, as far as I know, there's not a specific letter of interpretation on this. If someone knows about one, please share it with me. This is also probably a good time to mention that the FAA does have a lot of letters of interpretation, and sometimes they change their mind. Or sometimes one part of the FAA says one thing and another part of the FAA says another. And that is frustrating. What do we do about it? We just need to do the best we can with the information we have. And we need to be able to point to something in writing and say, hey, this is what it says. So my interpretation of this, and again, some of this is opinion based on experience. When we start moving the airplane under its own power, basically spinning the propeller for the purpose of flight, until the end of that flight after landing, when it stops moving under its own power, that whole time is considered flight time. I do know that other countries use other definitions. So again, those of you who are not operating under FAA, be careful. The part that I changed my mind on, so an example that would not be flight time. Someone starts up their airplane for the purpose of relocating to the other side of the airport to the self-serve fuel. Okay. The whole purpose of starting the airplane is to go get fuel, not to go fly. They hold short of the active runway for 20 minutes waiting for traffic before they get over there. They end up having 0.4 hours on the hobs. Is that flight time? No, because the definition specifically says for the purpose of flight. So that one is crystal clear. A different example that has happened to me in real life is we go out to fly. The purpose is to fly. We start up, we do our taxi, and during the run-up, we have a fouled spark plug. We're not able to clear it. The airplane's not airworthy. We taxi back, and we had 0.3, maybe even 0.4 on the hobs. Well, I used to think that the first part of that, up until we found the squawk, that was for the purpose of flight. We should log that as flight time. And, reading what it says. And I don't even remember where it was. It might have been on social media somewhere having a discussion. Someone pointed out the last part of this definition, which is for the purpose of flight and ends when the aircraft comes to rest after landing. And what this other person was pointing out is if you never took off, you never landed. And if you never landed, you can't say that you met this definition. Okay, and that seems fair. So I've actually changed my mind on the interpretation of this in recent years, that if our wheels never left the ground, none of it can be counted as flight time. This actually just happened on a check ride. The engine wasn't performing. This is just a couple days ago. Engine wasn't performing as it should have been, and the applicant rejected the takeoff. She did a great rejected takeoff. We went back, squawked the airplane, never left the ground, so we couldn't log any of that as flight. Or she, of course, I'm the examiner. I don't log time. She could not log any of that time because we never left the ground. So,
and that's certainly similar to the definition that the NTSB uses for accidents. So, for example, in your case, if you were taxiing across the airport to the fuel island, you had no intention for flight. Along the way, you hit a fuel truck and everything went up in flames. Everybody died. Not an accident because there was no intention for flight.
Yeah. And I think it's been a while since I looked at that one, but NTSB, don't they get into something about from the time the first person gets on the aircraft until the last person disembarks? Or like there's specific definitions. And again, just read what it says and go by what it says.
Yeah, certainly. Anytime I want to know, I look it up because it's too complex to remember. Well, let's talk about something else that I think is a little complex, and I suspect I've gotten wrong numerous times in the past. Logging simulator time. That's a whole area unto itself.
And back to my earlier story, that's kind of what prompted me to sit down and start typing this out. And so I did have a lot to say about it. Let me go ahead and follow along in my own document here. So logging simulator time is going to be page 6. And so logging time is 61.51. And I linked to that here from the document so people can go look at that. And you want to be sure to include the type and identification of the sim being used, the location where the lesson occurred, and time that was simulated instrument conditions. And that's important, especially for someone who's going for an instrument rating, for example, and they're using an approved flight training device. We use the term sim generically. It actually could be a basic aviation training device, an advanced aviation training device, a flight training device, a full motion flight simulator. There's all types of different sims, and I talk about that a little bit here. But basically, if you're in something like a Redbird or a Frasca, or a Precision Flight Controls, those are the types of machines we're going to see at flight schools. Most of them these days are an advanced aviation training device. And you want to have some kind of a identification, or record of that in your logbook of what the type of sim that's being used. And if you're flying or using a variety of them, you may want to have a separate column for your full flight simulator versus your FTD versus your ATD, that kind of thing. I said basic ATD. I don't think we're using that term anymore, are we? As far as basic or advanced, I think we're just calling them all ATDs under the current definition. And there's a lot of confusion on this because the FAA has revamped this in recent years. So those of us that have been around a while, it's kind of hard to keep up.
Well, and sometimes people will also take pictures of the letter that the local FSDO has put out every year saying that particular trainer has been approved. Talk about the requirements. Is that something you look for when you're doing a check ride?
So for anyone that's not familiar, most people understand that to officially log sim time towards a certificate or rating, that machine needs to be approved by the administrator, the FAA. And the way that you know it's approved is that letter that you referred to. And that letter is supposed to be with the simulator. A lot of flight schools will frame it and hang it on the wall. A lot will put it in a 3-ring binder that sits with the sim. But the pilot in training, the flight instructor that's involved, everyone, you need to make sure you've got that letter because that is, do your due diligence and make sure. And that letter specifically outlines what that machine is allowed to be used for. To answer your question about check rides, there's no requirement for DPEs to verify that. We're basically trusting that the training was done in an approved device. That would be more on the flight instructor on their shoulders to make sure that they're using an approved device when they do that training.
Okay. You had something down at the bottom of your document where you talked about currency and you referenced our mutual friend, Mike Chesh, talked about takeoffs and landings being logged. Talk about that.
So, Mike, very experienced flight instructor and airline pilot. And I think what happened is I shared this document on social media and he quickly said, I've got a cool article from 2017. And I loved it so much that I included it here at the end of my document. So if I remember correctly, this is getting back to paying attention to the details, especially when you're going for a certificate or rating and understanding, a lot of people just talk about, I need to go get my currency landings. Well, the regulation actually says takeoffs and landings. And a lot of people will be like, well, duh. I mean, how can I go do a landing if I didn't do a takeoff? And you'd be surprised because another part of that, just using currency as an example. So we're talking about 61.57. It also says sole manipulator of the controls. So I can tell you as a flight instructor, it's very easy to be in a scenario where the person next to you does the takeoff and then you do the landing as the sole manipulator of the controls, or even people that are not flight instructors. A lot of pilot friends will fly together and one person will do the takeoff and a different person will do the landing. And part of what adds to the confusion and the challenge is some logbooks give you the ability to log takeoffs and landings separately. And I've seen some logbooks that don't. Sometimes you have to put it in the comments or you have to use another column. But I think most modern logbooks give you the option of takeoffs and landings. And then there's even another question. One of my other sections in this document talks about how flight instructors should log things. And it's just opinion. I share the way that I've done it. My biggest advice is be consistent. For example, as a flight instructor, we might go out and do 10 landings, takeoffs and landings on a lesson. And maybe I demonstrated 2 of them. And they were just 2 landings. The applicant or the pilot in training, what's the new term? A learner. The learner did all 10 takeoffs. I did 2 landings and they did 8 landings as sole manipulated controls. Well, as the flight instructor, I'm pilot in command. I put all 10 takeoffs and landings in my logbook. And then maybe in the remarks put that the applicant performed 8 of them, that kind of thing, just so I have my own record. And some other people may say, you know what, I only want to log the ones where I'm the sole manipulator. Like, that's fine. It's your logbook. You do it however you want. Again, just be consistent. So you're not going back and forth day to day or week to week. Just be consistent. And that way you've got accurate information. But as long as it's based on a good plan and, sound judgment, I think people will be in good shape. So did that answer your question?
Indeed. And I was thinking back, I recall years ago, I did something incorrectly for a while related to night takeoffs and landings, for example. I always thought, gee, I need 3 landings in the past 90 days to carry passengers. Didn't realize there was a requirement there for takeoffs. And there were certainly a number of cases where I took off in the daytime and I landed in the nighttime. And I thought, oh, okay, I'm done. I got 1 out of my 3. It's like, no, actually, I got 1 out of my 6 because I didn't have a night takeoff to go along with that night landing.
There you go. Yep, great example.
As we start to wrap up here, any other thoughts in general about logging?
Just the fact that I realized there's a lot of details here. We can really get into the, but it says this and it says that. And a lot of people may already be rolling their eyes like, oh, why is this even important? And I'll just tell you, unfortunately, I've got a fair amount of experience dealing with aviation attorneys. I spent a lot of time in management. Spent a lot of time consulting flight schools. And I can tell you that a lot of what we talked about here, well, it's valuable for the people that are going for interviews, trying to get jobs in aviation. Certainly having a clean, accurate logbook is important. I hope that crowd that's listening, they're paying attention. There's also this other thing about liability. And I appreciate the idea of innocent till proven guilty. And let me just say, I've been involved enough with depositions and being on the defense side of an accident. I can tell you that these details do matter. And the way to think of it is, did I log the 3 takeoffs as sole manipulator controls? It's one of those things that nobody cares until there's an investigation. And then everybody cares. And from the FAA's point of view, from the NTSB point of view, from the attorney's point of view, it doesn't even really matter what reality is. It matters what was documented. And I know that kind of sucks the fun out of what we really love about going and flying airplanes, in a way. And it's the reality of the world we live in. It's, I love flying airplanes. I love that it's my career. I love that I'm able to teach and do check rides, and everything about aviation is just a joy to me. And there's this kind of dark side called liability. And unfortunately, sometimes there's accidents and incidents that lead to an investigation. And as long as you have your ducks in a row, your I's are dotted, your T's are crossed, it's just a paperwork exercise and it's no big deal. But as soon as something's not right, boy, oh boy, they just latch onto it. So I know that's a little bit of a negative motivation, but again, I'm speaking from experience. So I hope people take it seriously.
Very well said. For folks who might be interested in taking a check ride with you down in the Southwest, tell us a little bit about your check rides and how they would find out more about you.
Well, I appreciate that. We're busy here in the Phoenix area, and I'm actually scheduled way into the future. So I appreciate the referral. People are welcome to contact me, but I may say, hey, nothing available right now. But I do have a lot of resources available. My website is flywithjim.com. If you go on the main menu under check rides, there's a page called check ride preparation. And I've got some resources there for private, instrument, commercial, and then all people, particularly what I call my check ride observations and suggestions. There are a couple of documents. I've got one for private and commercial. I've got another one for instrument. Basically, it's just things I've noticed that are commonly misunderstood or commonly not noticed in the ACS. And I want people to realize, the FAA would like people to realize that these things are important. So those documents are there on my website for people to look at. I've got links to some great videos from our friend Seth Lake, some of the work he's done going over the ACS. Really appreciate him and all of his hard work on those things. So yeah, just flywithjim.com is a great way to go find all that good stuff.
Jim, thanks so much for joining us here today.
Hey, thank you, Max. This was a pleasure.
And my thanks to Jim Pitman for joining us here today. You can find more about Jim at his main website at flywithjim.com. You can also find the page regarding logging that he talked about at flywithjim.com/pilot logbooks. And let me go ahead and read a couple of your emails. We'll save some for next week. First, from Alexander Sack. He says, regarding transponder codes starting with a 0, and I had mentioned that here in Northern California, a lot of our codes start with 03 or 53 if you're VFR. He says, I'm pretty sure it means local if your squawk code starts with a 0. Basically, they can bounce you around until you leave the area. That's what it is all over the East Coast, and I would be surprised if it were different on the West Coast. Though I agree, SoCal airspace is unique. I confirmed this with a friend who works for N90 in New York. Alexander, thanks so much for that. And here's an email from Patreon supporter Bill Remington. He said, I recently listened to episode 234 and had a question about charitable flights. Our local small Catholic church has an annual fundraiser for the Catholic elementary school. A popular raffle item is a flight with a member pilot who is commercially rated. My understanding is these flights are limited to pilots with greater than 400 hours of experience, do not need to be commercially rated. The flight must begin and end at the same airport and be within 40 nautical miles of the departure airport. Is that correct? Am I missing anything? Aviation News Talk is my favorite aviation podcast. I always appreciate your in-depth analysis and comprehensive teaching points. GA is fortunate to have you as an ambassador of excellence. Well, that's very kind of you. Thank you, Bill. And I wrote back to him that I knew that the distance, which he referred to, is not 40 nautical miles, but it's actually 25 nautical miles. That's in the rules for any sightseeing flight, charitable or otherwise. Now, I didn't know the hours requirement, so I researched that online, and I found a full list of regulations regarding charitable flights on AOPA.org, and I'll go ahead and include a link to that in the show notes for anyone who's interested in doing charitable flights and wanting to know what the many requirements are. But it says that pilots need to have 500 hours in order to conduct those flights. Bill, I hope that helps, and thanks so much for supporting the show over the past 3.5 years. And I want to thank everyone who supports the show. There are lots of ways you can do that. You can simply send me an email, which I may end up reading here on the show. You could tell a friend about Aviation News Talk, which is the main way that we grow the show. So please do that today if you haven't done that before. Of course, you could also leave a review on your podcast player using whatever app that you're currently using right now to listen to us. And of course, you can always support the show financially. And my thanks to everyone who helps support the show in any way you do. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up.